I'm very conscious that I have quite a strong, broad Scottish accent, and also tonight I'm going to be talking about things that in the room there will be those who have a lot of knowledge about and those who maybe have very little knowledge of Scotland. So I'm delighted we're going to have a chance to have questions and answers and discussion afterwards as well, because understanding exactly what I say is not always easy, as was shown to me when in the very last major public engagement I had when I was First Minister back in 2007. I opened a big school on the outskirts of Glasgow, brand new school, and we had a fabulous ceremony in a lecture theatre larger than this, with everybody turned out in the best possible clothes, and everything from some singing by the pupils to a couple of speeches, and even the curtain on the little plaque managed to go back at the right time when I pulled the cord. The whole ceremony had gone perfectly, and afterwards I went to the head teacher's room to do an interview for the local radio station. And there was one little boy sitting outside the head teacher's room, as there is in every school in the land. And I used to be a school teacher, and in these situations couldn't really resist the temptation to stop. So I stopped and confronted this poor little boy who was down here on a seat in front of a number of other VIP guests who had followed me into the room, and said, what are you doing here this morning? Why were you not in the assembly? And he murmured something quietly into his chest. And I thought, right, I'm going to pursue this. So I said, have you been in trouble this morning? Are you waiting for the head teacher because you've been in trouble? And he kind of half looked up and said, yes, yeah, I've been in trouble this morning. And I thought, right, what can I do? I'm not a school teacher anymore. I can't give him a punishment. But maybe I could frighten him a bit. So in the spur of the moment, I said, do you realize that I'm in charge of all the prisons in Scotland? And he looked up at me with a big smile on his face and said, you'll have met my big brother then. Wasn't quite what I meant. So if there's anything that's not clear tonight, please feel free to raise it in the questions afterwards. I want to say, make some brief introductory comments about how we got to where we are. Why are we having a referendum in 2014 on Scottish independence, and the history of the development of the Union. To say something about where we are right now with that debate and the choices that Scotland will face next year, but also about what might come next, and in posing the question, is independence the only stable future for Scotland? I thought that might be slightly provocative, because there are many who would say that independence is not a stable future for Scotland, and there were many who would say that if Scotland does not choose independence, then that is Scotland choosing stability. But I'm going to slightly disagree with both points of view, and say some things that might spark off some thought and discussion, I hope. And if I cover ground that some of you are already well aware of, I apologise in advance, but I'll try and summarise as briefly as possible how I think we got to where we are today. In the Union of 1707, between Scotland and the rest of the UK, it was recognised even then that there were certain things that were distinctive in Scotland, that were different and had to be preserved. So when the then Scottish Parliament essentially voted to join the UK, to go into union with England, the conditions that were attached to that included the preservation of the distinctive Scottish religion of the time, the distinctive Scottish legal system, which we still of course have today, and the distinctive Scottish education system. It's interesting that that was the third element that was chosen. And by and large, that agreement, that there would be a certain recognition at the UK level that these areas were distinctive and they would be left alone, but the country would be governed as a whole across the whole United Kingdom, really pretty much lasted until the 1960s. There were some changes in government along that time, the creation of a specific Scottish office and so on. But by and large, in the 19th and in the first 60 years of the 20th century, the idea that there was one Britain, where decisions were made pretty commonly across the whole country, and the country was one force, was pretty much accepted by everyone. And I think that's quite important, that it was the 1960s when this started to change. There's a lot of talk about this being about Scottish identity and so on. Sometimes maybe a rejection of England or that British identity. But I think it was as much related to the opening up of public debate, the opening up of ideas, the move away from a society where things were perhaps more uniform in the 1960s, that helped create the atmosphere that started this process of debate about Scottish nationalism and the Scottish political identity. So the end of deference, the end of that kind of political culture in the 1960s, I think, was a major contribution towards where we've got to today. My first vote was cast in 1979 in a referendum, the first referendum for Scottish devolution. And I was convinced at the time, although I voted yes, and I was a very active campaigner for a yes vote then, and it was the first campaign I ever really was, voting campaign I was ever really actively involved in as a student. I was pretty much convinced then that what was on offer was less than adequate, and it had really just been offered by the then Labour government as a compromise with Scotland, as an attempt to appease Scotland, rather than as an attempt to improve the government of Britain and improve the government of Scotland. And I think that was seen through by the people of Scotland, and that was one of the reasons why the vote was not successful at that time, that people didn't believe the motives. They didn't believe that the scheme had been thought through properly and that it was going to actually work in practice. So when Scotland didn't vote by enough votes for devolution in 1979, the issue then appeared to go off the agenda. And then began a period of 15 to 18 years ultimately that culminated in 1997 with the next referendum. And one of the key elements of that period was actually not the rise of nationalism or a current of nationalism through Scotland, but a desire in Scotland to get the scheme right the next time. An understanding, perhaps amongst a new generation, that there had to be greater cross-party agreement, that couldn't be a scheme that belonged to one party rather than another, and there had to be greater support amongst the general population, every part of Scotland, not just some parts of Scotland, for strong devolution to a Scottish Parliament. That is why there was set up a constitutional convention involving all parties, actually, ironically, apart from the Nationalists, but all the pro-devolution parties and all the forces in civic Scotland coming together to agree a platform for a devolved Scottish Parliament that was then enacted by the Labour government and put to a referendum and won a huge majority, 3/4 of the people voting for it in 1997. And then, of course, the next milestone was the creation of the Parliament itself in 1999. And suddenly Scottish politicians, and I mention this specifically because I'll come back to it later, suddenly Scottish politicians finding that they had the powers that they had been demanding all these years in this new Parliament. It wasn't just about campaigning to create the Parliament anymore, it was about using the Parliament to help change Scotland. And for the first 2 or 3 years, those new parliamentarians really struggling to deal with the fact that they had gained those powers, struggling to find the policies, the legislation that would be distinctive and would make a significant difference in Scotland and indeed perhaps even beyond. And but then the Parliament found its feet, and I would say, and maybe this I was slightly biased in this, given that I was First Minister at the time, but I will say that I think in the period between 2002 to 2007, perhaps slightly beyond that as well, the Parliament passed a lot of really interesting, sometimes very challenging legislation that was really making a difference and had been thought through in Scotland. For the very first time, we had a Parliament where the debates were taking place amongst people who had stood for election to the Scottish Parliament on platforms that were about the powers of the Scottish Parliament, and then resolved decisions and new legislation that was based within those powers of what it could achieve to help change lives in Scotland. And at times we were moving faster than the rest of the United Kingdom. The Cabinet in the UK had rejected the idea of a ban in smoking in public places, tough opposition, senior figures in the government and from the opposition in London at that time. In Scotland, we managed to not only persuade the Parliament, but persuade the country, and perhaps the least healthy part of Britain, to give up smoking. And I think that decision was interesting because if the Westminster government had agreed to experiment with a smoking ban in Scotland, can you imagine what the reaction would have been? But because the Scottish Parliament had passed the legislation, there became, even amongst the smokers, a national pride in the fact that that had happened. And to my dying day, I will look back on the day when the ban came in, and there were no disruptions, no problems with the police or with publicans or in restaurants anywhere in Scotland. Nobody tried to break the ban for that whole first day, and contrary to all of the expectations. So the significance then of a parliament that could make its own decisions, sometimes reflect the popular will, but sometimes challenge it as well, but have the credibility to do that, I think was significant. Now, of course, in the period since then, we've had this rise in the campaign for independence. And we face a vote next year in 2014 that will challenge all of us, really, to make what might well be I hope will be a once in a generation, perhaps even once in a lifetime decision to either bring this about or to end the debate and get on with the kind of governance that we have in Scotland and the rest of the UK today. The plan, for those of you who are not as involved in it as those of us, some of us have no choice to be, is that there will be a vote next September. All people who live in Scotland at that time and are on the electoral register will have a chance to vote, all those over the age of 16, not just those over the age of 18. The nationalist plan is that Scotland would retain the pound, would still have the Queen as head of state, but in all other aspects would be independent from the rest of the UK. At the moment, public opinion in Scotland looks as if it has strengthened against this plan, and it seems perhaps unlikely at this stage that there will be a yes vote. Personally, I think with 12 months to go, that can't be taken for granted, and I think there's a lot of campaigning, a lot of debate, and potentially some big shifts in public opinion still to take place. But what I want to say tonight is partly about the situation in Scotland, but also about the situation more widely in the rest of the United Kingdom, because at the same time as this Scottish Parliament was created, we've also had a number of other quite radical constitutional changes that affect the rest of the United Kingdom. At the same time as the Parliament was being elected, the House of Lords was being reformed dramatically for the first time since the 1950s, with the ending of the automatic right of hereditary peers to sit in the House of Lords. But in many ways, that is unfinished business. And there's still a debate about whether the House of Lords should be elected or not, whether it should be changed in other fundamental ways. At the same time as the Scottish Parliament was finding its feet in the early part, in those first 2 or 3 years of the 21st century, the EU Enlargement was taking place, up to now 27, 28 nations, and changes were taking place to European governance that had implications for us in the UK since then, and will have implications as the debate takes place around the European referendum over these next few years. At the same time as all of this was happening, different electoral systems were being agreed for so many different bodies in the UK. We now have different electoral system for elections to the European Parliament in England, Wales and Scotland, for elections to the European Parliament in Northern Ireland, which is different, elections to local government, 3 different systems in different parts of the United Kingdom, elections to the Westminster Parliament, elections to the Welsh Assembly, elections to the Scottish Parliament, all different electoral systems at different levels, plus directly elected mayors in London and in a number of other cities and local authority areas. Massive constitutional changes, changing the way that Britain was governed for decades, in the course of 1 decade, but in almost every case, in my view, unfinished business. So at the same time as you have this debate taking place in Scotland of, to some extent, rising nationalism, at the very least bringing to the boil and to a decision the issue of Scottish independence, you also have these other changes taking place in the UK and general disillusionment with politics. And I think that's the context for whether or not we can find stability in Scotland and perhaps in the rest of the UK too, either through independence or through a different political approach in the UK as a whole. I don't think it is entirely unreasonable of the nationalists, with whom I disagree fundamentally on their main point for many, many reasons. I don't think it's fundamentally wrong of them to argue that it is possible that an independent Scotland, in a friendly relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom, might be a more stable situation than what we have experienced over the last 20 or 30 years. It is entirely possible that governments in Scotland and in what remained of the rest of the United Kingdom, filled with people of goodwill, could find working arrangements and on economic matters, on international matters, perhaps even on some very detailed domestic matters, where they could work together. They may well be independent of each other, but they could work together, and actually relations might improve rather than deteriorate. I think it's not unlikely that in such a situation the confidence of the people of Scotland might rise, and the sort of dependency culture that still exists in much of Scotland could be challenged, and actually Scots could do more to stand on their own 2 feet. And that might not necessarily be a bad thing. So it is possible that independence might be a stable future for Scotland and provide more stability also in the rest of the UK. Although I think there are 2 key factors, or in fact maybe 3 key factors that work against that. One is, I think, the unresolved issue of the currency. And I think this will be a major debate between now and next September in Scotland. The current position of the Scottish Government, and this seems to be a general consensus amongst those, the vast majority of those who support independence in Scotland today, is that you would have an independent Scotland with all its taxation and other economic powers completely independent of the rest of the UK, but Scotland would adopt the pound as its currency. And of course the pound and all decisions that affect that would remain a matter for the Bank of England, which is created by and instituted as part of what would then be the rest of the United Kingdom. And I think instinctively everything tells me that that is an unstable situation. For any country to have, any independent country to have a currency over which it has no control whatsoever is an inherently unstable position, and one that isn't going to be sustainable and is going to lead to tensions, because decisions will be made by the Bank of England that will not suit the economy in Scotland, and Scotland will have no influence over that. And therefore that arrangement with the currency is unlikely to lead to the kind of stability that some people believe independence might produce. The second area where I think there's real potential for instability is in relation to Europe, and I suppose that instability is possible anyway, given the government's, or at least the lead party in the government's view that there should be a referendum in 2017. But the second area would be in relation to Europe, where there is at least a possibility that we could find ourselves with Scotland inside the European Union and the rest of the UK outside the European Union. And I think that would be obviously a very, very challenging situation. And I don't believe that Scotland's immediate transfer to membership of the European Union would be as smooth as is necessarily the case put forward by colleagues in the SNP. And the third area, given its prominence today in political debate, that I think there may be problems in terms of stability with independence, would be in relation to immigration and border control. There's long been a view that there could be a relatively soft border between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom if Scotland was an independent country. And I think today, with the level of political prominence given to the debate about immigration and who comes in and out and across borders, I think that is increasingly unlikely. that whatever the situation would be, there would ultimately be a position where there was a different immigration policy in Scotland than there was in the rest of the United Kingdom. There was an increasing lack of coherence between the two, and the border between the two countries would have to be strengthened as a result, because some people would have the right to be in Scotland but not have the right at the same time to be south of the border, or vice versa. And therefore, I think that is an unstable situation waiting to happen. And on the other hand, I think it is possible, and this is the joy of not being a minister anymore, because it's possible to perhaps look more widely and throw out some ideas here that might provoke some discussion. I think it's possible to envision a different kind of approach by politicians and government in the United Kingdom that produces a more stable arrangement than we have today across the whole of the United Kingdom, including the devolved nations in Scotland and indeed in Wales and in Northern Ireland. And I think there are three preconditions for that. The first, and probably the most important, is that there has to be a complete change, a transformation of the language, the attitude, the understanding of the United Kingdom that we have today and the part of our political leadership. And I say that in relation to all of the main political parties operating in Westminster. I don't think any of the UK party leaderships, either the previous generation that created these changes across the UK, or the current generation who lead the parties, have really fully grasped what has happened these past 15 years. It seems to me that what we have now in place, and it's an imperfect structure, but it is a structure, what we have now in place is a far greater recognition of what the United Kingdom is, rather than perhaps what the concept of Britain was for the first 250 or so years of the Union. To me, the United Kingdom is the most successful example of shared sovereignty anywhere in the world. That what you basically have is historically independent nations. I know there are some people who would maybe argue about that status in relation to Wales, but that's, I think the way that Wales has performed these last 15 years with its own devolution has perhaps dealt with that historical debate. But basically, you have a United Kingdom that is signified in the central lobby of the Houses of Parliament, with the four mosaics, or St David for Wales, St Patrick for Ireland, St Andrew for Scotland, St George for England, in the ceiling of the central lobby, bringing together the four nations in a United Kingdom. And today it seems to me that we have a United Kingdom structure that recognises the historic nations that make up that kingdom, with the possible exception of having a recognition for England, and not an idea that can be forced on people of one form of Britishness. And it is time, for me, it is time for the politicians, the leaders of our great British institutions at the United Kingdom level, to recognise that that is the place, and that what we do on these islands is share our sovereignty, pull it for the greater good. And that would then lead to me to argue there needs to be a number of changes to the way government and institutions operate to help support that concept of taking the United Kingdom as our basis, rather than Britishness or Britain as the basis for how we are governed. One is that I think it is long overdue that we get rid of individual Secretaries of State for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in the British Cabinet. Completely unnecessary, unjustified, in my view, given that so many powers are now devolved to the two assemblies in the Parliament in Edinburgh. The case, it seems to me, for a Department of the Nations and Regions, or a Department of Constitutional Affairs with a Secretary of State, whatever it would be called, that would be responsible for relationships with these devolved parliaments and assemblies and other constitutional matters, I think as time has come, it should have been done by Tony Blair in 2005. It should have been done by David Cameron when he took over in 2010. it should certainly be done by whoever is the next Prime Minister in 2015. Alongside that, there is a need to revise the financial arrangement. You cannot have a 1970s arrangement that allocates money between England, Scotland, the regions of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland operating in the second decade of the 21st century. Because that creates tensions as well. If we're going to have stability, we need to have a fairer financial arrangement. And thirdly, we need to celebrate diversity. Charles' predecessor as Home Secretary, David Blunkett, came to Scotland in 2004 as Home Secretary to discuss a number of things with me, and used a phrase that I've always remembered. He said that the old one-size-fits-all UK doesn't exist anymore. We're in a new era. And to me, that's true, that it is possible for different parts of England, for Scotland, for Wales, for Northern Ireland, to experiment with different kinds of policy, like the smoking ban, prove that they can work, and then be transferred to other parts of the nation, and us to celebrate that fact and not be jealous of it or resentful of it or try and suppress it in any way. That's what happens elsewhere in the world, and it should be able to happen inside the United Kingdom. So I think there's a need for an attitude change and a whole new approach amongst the Westminster political leadership and the leaders of our British institutions. The second thing I think is important, and I'll not dwell on this tonight because I suspect there are not many Scots in the audience, so you're maybe not as directly affected by this as I am. But we desperately need to raise, and this may well be the case elsewhere as well, raise the level of political debate and the exchange of ideas on policy options. Certainly in Scotland, that's probably true for the whole country. But we have a desperate lack of thinking of new ideas. It may come as a surprise to some of you to know that a new Scotland Act was passed last year by the Houses of Parliament here in London, which devolves further taxation powers to Edinburgh. A good idea, more responsibility for raising the money that the Parliament spends in Edinburgh. An idea, again, long overdue and a good one. And by 2015, there will no longer be stamp duty or landfill tax in Scotland. The Scottish Parliament will choose whether or not to raise that revenue from a form of stamp duty or a form of landfill tax, or perhaps some new tax that would be an equivalent but perhaps on a different basis. By 2016, the UK rate of income tax in Scotland will be 10 pence, and the equivalent money will be taken out of the Scottish budget, and the Scottish Parliament will have to decide if it raises the 10 pence rate of tax that would be the case elsewhere in the United Kingdom to make up the difference, or less or more, cut the budget, increase the budget, or whatever. But it will have actual fiscal responsibility for the first time since its creation in 1999, and that is a good thing. Not one current Scottish politician has made a speech this year saying what they would like to do with those new tax rates. And I think that in some ways it signifies a problem with politics across the whole country, not just in Scotland. But it's particularly acute in Scotland. There is a lack of think tanks, a lack of academic work on this, and a lack of political creativity. And until we have those kind of debates about what we do with the powers we have, then there are always going to be debates about whether we need more powers or the powers of independence. So for stability, there has to be a regeneration of political debate in Scotland. And to me, particularly Labour and the Conservative parties should be leading that debate, posing real choices for people and not being part of some muddy centre that says nothing about what you would use with these significant new powers when they come along. And the third thing, and I'd be interested to see what Charles thinks of this when I talk to him afterwards tonight. I think that model that we had in Scotland, and I'll finish on this point, that model that we had in Scotland back in the late 80s and through the early part of the 1990s of a constitutional convention, where we brought together the elected members, at that time the elected members of the Westminster Parliament in Scotland, and the political parties. We brought together the local authorities, we brought together business, civic society, other organisations, and we debated and discussed and compromised and resolved some tough questions and designed a parliament that has been sustained in power and has worked effectively following its creation. That model, I think, is now needed across the United Kingdom. We've had these piecemeal changes to our constitutional setup and our governance in the UK. In addition to those that I mentioned earlier, the piecemeal reform of the House of Lords, the piecemeal introduction of elected mayors in some parts of the country, the different forms of devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the failed attempt to get devolution in the northeast of England, the different electoral systems, now 7 or 8 different electoral systems for different bodies across the whole of the UK. We've also got the Human Rights Act. We have other constitutional provisions that are in place that weren't in place 20 years ago. And we have this issue of the relationship with Europe. And it seems to me that no one individual party is going to put together a programme at the UK level that is going to outline a way forward to take all these piecemeal changes, each of which individually were probably good and deserving at their time, but pull them into a whole that says this is how Britain should be governed in the 2020s. This is where our country should be going to regenerate confidence and belief in government and democratic accountability, but also to serve the country well at home and abroad in the decisions that we make. And I think in the absence of a political party leading that debate, and it seems to me none of the current political party leaderships have a number of ideas on this that they are outlining to us at the moment, then some kind of convention that pulled together people from different points of view, but with some legitimacy in the positions that they are in, to debate these ideas over a number of years and then try and find a way forward that there might even be a broad cross-party consensus around, would be a very, very good thing for the country as a whole. And I think if we were able to do that, if we were able to have a change in the approach and in the language of governing the United Kingdom, understanding that we share sovereignty on these islands and we celebrate diversity and decision-making in different places at the same time as sharing the responsibility for the decisions we make. If we can generate a better political debate, particularly in the devolved nations where that debate has perhaps been lacking for too long, and if we could have a way forward on the overall constitutional arrangements for the United Kingdom that had a broader agreement than one party and would therefore sustain through more than one period of government, then I think we could create the kind of stability that I believe people not only in Scotland but elsewhere in the United Kingdom would like to see. Thank you very much.